Zipper rolls out to the right, pitches off to Taylor, and Taylor's to the 20, down to the 15, down to the 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Touchdown, Billy Taylor! Touchdown, Billy Taylor! Billy Taylor scored a touchdown from 21 yards out. The crowd goes berserk. It was November 22nd, 1969. That they came to Barry, Michigan, all dressed in maize and blue. The words were said, the prayers were read, and everybody cried. But when they closed the coffin, there was someone else inside. Oh, they came to Barry, Michigan, but Michigan wasn't dead. And when the game was over, it was someone else instead. 11 Michigan Wolverines put on the gloves of gray, and as the organ played the victors, they laid Woody Hayes away. Under center is Wangler at the 45. He goes back. He's looking for a receiver. He throws downfield to Carter. Who's got it better than us? Nobody!
Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Our guest this week is beat writer Aaron McMann from MLive. Before he joins us, let's get it rolling with my view from Section 17. On last week's show, I said progress and getting a W was all I wanted to see against Nebraska, and we got it. Been a long time since we've witnessed a beatdown in the big house like that. There was improvement in every facet of our game, but most notably with the offensive line. In the end, it was a nice win, and we got 81 players on the field, and man, it felt good to watch a dominating performance. Now we have to carry it forward. That starts this Saturday in Northwestern against a wounded Northwestern team, one that lost its leading rusher, Jeremy Larkin, on Monday when he was forced to retire because of a neck injury. Still, it's a road game, and if we bring our A game, we should walk out of Ryan Field with another W. Pat Fitzgerald and his team are coming off a bye week, so they will have had plenty of time to prepare for us. Beat writer Aaron McMann from MLive says this is the kind of game Michigan needs to take control of early and not let the Wildcats hang around. He joins us next on this week's Game Day segment to discuss the Nebraska Big Ten opener and share his thoughts on this Saturday's trip to Evanston. Here on the Michigan Man on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Here with us on our Game Day segment this week to take a look back at a big win on Saturday against Nebraska, beat writer Aaron McMann from MLive. Great to have you back with us, Aaron.
It's good to be back, Mike.
Well, I think all Michigan fans are saying that is the most complete game we have seen from a Michigan team in a long time, Aaron. I can't remember the last time we saw a performance like that.
Yeah, I just did finish my my team grades yesterday afternoon, and I think I ranked most of the groups with either A's or A minus. You're right, it was a top to bottom, an impressive performance. The offense got going early on. They got the ground game going and never really relented. Defense was kind of swarming there early, and Nebraska never got anything going offensively. And then we saw some pretty incredible plays from the special teams, too. So, all around, really good performance. They got, I think, 81 guys into the game. Several, a lot of backups. They played all three quarterbacks. It was a good game.
Yesterday, I was perusing the internet, looking at stories, especially national stories, and the perspective of how Michigan is playing. A lot of the comment from reporters was, it was just Nebraska, so what? But, if you're following Michigan as a fan, as a writer, you have to say, okay, it was Nebraska, but there was marked progress in so many areas, wasn't there?
Yeah, that's the thing I think you got to go off at this point, because you got to remember, after Notre Dame, so many of us were kind of questioning whether this was the same offense we saw last year, whether this defense maybe had regressed a little bit. There are all these question marks, and then I think that you're right. The last 3 weeks they've done a good job of, at least from the offensive perspective, for sure, definitely. They've shown improvement. The offensive line I think has looked better. The quarterback play certainly has been better. The receivers I think have taken the biggest jump of any of the position groups. And then the last couple of weeks, and Michigan's been down a running back, and they've still done a decent job of moving the football. So it's been a it's cautiously, I think many Michigan, like you mentioned, many Michigan fans are looking at this, cautiously optimistic. It has been Western Michigan, SMU, and Nebraska. But I was curious to see how this offensive line would fare against the Big Ten opponent on Saturday, and I thought they handled themselves really well. So there's a lot to like. The schedule's not going to get any easier. They've got some quality opponents coming up here, in the next month or so. But right now, if you're a Michigan fan, you've got to be pretty happy considering, week one and how they played against Notre Dame.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And, for right now, it seems like Jim has found 5 guys in that offensive line. He's stuck with them all 4 games so far. And there was movement on Saturday, the entire game. That was what was impressive. That line it might be in small increments, but they are getting better.
Yeah, Jim's been talking for a few weeks now that he really thinks his offensive line has shown improvement, and that was starting with the Western Michigan game. I can remember after Notre Dame, several of us were questioning whether this line really was improved. He really did think it was. In the last 3 weeks, I think they've shown it. Brent Bettison's obviously been a key cog there on the line, and folks don't realize this, but after the Western Michigan win, it was a dominating win. I thought Shea Patterson looked very good. Michigan internally named Bredesen their offensive player of the week that week. So I think Cesar Ruiz has handled the center position well. He's a natural center who didn't play much, at the position last season, but I thought he's moved in there very well. Michael Onwenu has held himself well at right guard. The tackles, those have always been the question marks, and I don't think they played very well. The week one against Notre Dame, but I thought Saturday against Nebraska, particularly John Runyon. Remember those 2 big runs from Karan Higdon early in the first quarter. His 46-yard and 44-yard runs were both to the left side, and John Runyon did a good job of moving his block. So overall, I thought the line looked very good. There were, I think the quarterback was sacked once. They gave up a couple of tackles for loss, but by and large, against a Big Ten defensive line size-wise, they did well.
Well, there were some solid individual performances on Saturday, a lot of them really, starting with Devin Bush. I don't know, Aaron, if I have ever seen a linebacker that closes as fast as he does or just runs to the ball as fast as he does. He is just playing out of his mind right now, isn't he?
He is. Jim Harbaugh has been praising him, I think, going back to spring. He's said several times now that Devin Bush has been the fastest linebacker he's ever seen play. That's a big compliment. He played well on Saturday. I think he had 6 tackles. He had a sack, a couple tackles for loss. And obviously he didn't play the entire game, but when he did, his speed and his his ability to get the ball. That's the thing about him. He's a big, bulky guy, and he's shorter on the short side, but he's fast and he's built, and he's got a natural just tendency to get to the ball, and he's got this straight line speed. I think that very few linebackers have. He's played very well. There's a reason he was an All Big Ten linebacker last year. He'll be that again this year. And I think the only question mark left is how good he can get. Before the season, his name has come up obviously in NFL draft boards, and he'll assuredly go, barring something unfortunate. But yeah, he's looked very good. I know Don Brown is, he's been raving about him as well. I think Michigan feels very fortunate to have Devin Bush on their team.
And over on the offensive side of the ball, I think our depth maybe is a little bit better than we thought at running back. It might not be outstanding, but it's good. It was great to see Karan Higdon back this week. He's just got a little something else, it seems to me, Aaron, our other backs don't have. And I'm not sure what it is. I've always liked him, though, but whether it's better vision or quicker feet, it was a nice day from him, and we're going to need him big time the rest of the way.
Yeah, he's got a knack for finding holes, and he bulked up over the off season too. He put on like 10 or 15
Mm-hmm.
pounds, and it looks like his speed hasn't really taken a dive. He's been able to break through holes and find gaps, and now I think Saturday was his 7th 100-yard rushing game of his career. He's looked good so far. Now, obviously, he didn't play last week, but I thought he came off of not having played. He looked fresh, he looked ready to go, and he had those big runs early on, and that kind of put the nail in the coffin early against Nebraska. But no, he's been good. I think before the season started, I projected that he would rush for 1,200 yards, and I don't know if he'll get there just because of he didn't play last week, but he's looked just as good as he finished last season, plus some. But you're right, the running back depth has been okay. I was concerned about injuries, and we've seen that the last few weeks where Cron didn't play last week, Chris Evans didn't play against Nebraska. But I think True Wilson's handled himself well. Omar Samuel's trying to get more carries, and I think Michigan was able to get. Obviously, they used Ben Mason quite a bit on Saturday, but they're able to get Christian Turner in the game. So they're starting to get some more guys in the game. Omar Samuels is a guy I think could eventually be a good number 3 back for Michigan, maybe potentially number 2. I think he just needs more reps. But given the way Michigan's ground game has been going this first the last 3 weeks, I should say, they're able to get more guys in there. That'll bode well down the line later in the season.
As far as the Chris Evans injury, have you heard anything at all in the last week as what that might be?
We have not. Jim Harbaugh was real coy about it early in the week. We heard from him. We heard from running backs coach Jay Harbaugh, and they both had told us that they expected Cron and Chris to play against Nebraska. I guess the decision was made midway through the week not to play Chris. Hasn't been determined what his injury. They haven't revealed, I guess, what his injury is. It doesn't sound like it's something super serious. I mean, he started practice last week. He obviously played last week against SMU, but it was one of those things where I guess they felt like it was better for them to hold him out than to play him on Saturday.
Well, we've known now for a while Jim really likes Ben Mason. So do I. There are a lot of things we don't know after 4 games, but one thing we do know is this is a better offense when Ben Mason is on the field. The young man is a difference maker, isn't he, Aaron?
Yeah, and Jim loves him. The last couple of years he's raved about him. He calls him Bench Mason. Some folks have said he's the strongest guy on the team. I don't know if Jim sees a little bit of himself in Ben, but anything they ask him to do, he does. In practice, he'll play fullback. He's worked at linebacker. Obviously, he's carried the football. He's done a lot of things. He's played special teams. Jim, he's the type of guy I think Jim, knows that he would run through a wall for the football team. That's the type of guy he is. They like him a lot. Ben has said he'll do whatever he's asked. But yeah, the whole fullback, and they've used him a lot, obviously, in the red zone, along the near the end zone, and it's been successful. He's a big kid. He's tough. He's strong. And Saturday it worked well for him. He had 3 touchdowns, I think, on 6 carries and 18 yards.
I thought that was a great line from Ben after the game when he was asked when he was told he might be carrying the ball more, lining up as a back, and he says, well, it was about midweek, and coach said, we're going to want you to run the ball a little more, so just go in there and run the ball. So, I mean, as if it could be that simple, but it was interesting to see, and maybe we'll see more of that, of him being the single back.
I suspect so, especially if injuries continue to creep up with Evans or Higdon. They used them obviously last week, a little bit last week, or 2 weeks ago, I guess now, against SMU. But yeah, I mean, they're not afraid to use them. And you saw that a little bit, last year with the fullback. They used Henry Poggi a little bit. They used Khalid Hill on occasion. But Jim isn't afraid to use the fullback.
Well, Shea Patterson did what he needed to do once again, and even though the numbers, might not jump off the page at you, what he's giving this team in the way of leadership can't be measured in just the numbers alone right now, can it, Aaron?
No, he's been effective, and I think more or less that's what Michigan's needed out of the quarterback. Last year they had, we all know the story. They cycled through 3 different quarterbacks. They had injury issues. They struggled, but I think when it came down to it, they just weren't effective, and I think that's one of the biggest differences. I think with Shea Patterson, he's efficient, he's accurate. He doesn't make a ton of mistakes, and you saw that against Saturday. He was 15 to 22, 120, a touchdown. Didn't have to do a lot, but I think at the end of the day, if you ask Jim Harbaugh, I think that's kind of how he'd want to play. He'd rather get the ground game going early, move the football and keep Nebraska on its toes, and then when they need to, throw the ball. And that's kind of what Shea did on Saturday. It's a little bit different from how he played at Ole Miss, where he was slinging the ball around a ton and throwing for a ton of yards. But, Shea's been asked now the last couple of weeks about, about his play and the stats and everything else. And, he says, I'd rather just win. It doesn't matter what I put up. If I throw for 100 yards and a touchdown and we win, I'd rather do that as opposed to throwing for 300 yards and losing. So he's been, he's done what they've asked him to do. He's been pretty good at it. He's obviously improving, so learning, his teammates and the offense. But he's looked pretty good.
And, you sort of get the feeling, Aaron, that Jim and the offensive staff are just bringing this offense along slowly but surely. And yes, even though Shea Patterson has not been asked to do a lot, you do get the feel that when the playbook gets opened up, and it probably will have to in the next 4 to 5 games, that he can more than handle it.
Oh, absolutely. He was given a ton at Ole Miss. He was asked to do a lot. He was, he's very much the focal point of that offense, and he still is at Michigan. But Michigan having with Karan Higdon and Chris Evans and some of these weapons that elsewhere Michigan's been able to rely on. Shea hasn't as much responsibility. And I think that's maybe better off. He's still, keep in mind, it's still his first season at Michigan. Like I said, earlier, he's still learning things. He's still acclimated to his receivers and the line, everything else. But yes, I mean they've kind of brought this offense along slowly, but I think it's progressed every week. At some point, yes, they're going to open up. I thought maybe they would do against Nebraska, and they opted to play the run game and go to their strengths. But he's looked good. I think against you got Northwestern coming up. You've got Maryland after that. These might be a good opportunity for them to start advancing some things.
Well, another player that is ascending, as Jim likes to say, is Donovan Peoples-Jones, or DPJ, whatever you want to call him. What a difference a year makes, Aaron, because he is emerging now. This kid looks special, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. He was a guy, and you go back to last year, the receivers group was young, and we all knew it was talented, but they didn't really have much direction. There was no receivers coach, no dedicated receivers coach. They're all kind of a bunch of freshmen kind of walking around trying to figure things out. Donovan played in every game, and he looked better in others, than early on. But I think he, as the season went on, I thought he learned some stuff. He got better. And since the beginning of the season, I thought he looked much more polished, much more comfortable out there. And that's something we, talking to Nico Collins and talking to Peoples-Jones and talking to McElwain, a few weeks ago, that, they just look more comfortable and they look like they know what they're doing out there. And that includes Donovan. They're using him more in space, or using him more on, as opposed to just being a possession type receiver. I think he has the ability to do that, but his speed and his elusiveness and his athleticism, lends him, gives him more opportunities, and I think they've realized that, and they're starting to use him more in other situations. He had one catch on Saturday, but I think down the line you're going to see him. He is Michigan's leading receiver right now. I think he'll continue to be the number one target, and I think for him, him being a 5-star, recruit out of high school, he has an endless amount of talent. I really do, and I wrote this before the season, but I think the sky's the limit for him.
Absolutely is, and I know people were just, very concerned when Tariq Black went down, as we should have been. We were hoping to see him, and might see him later this year, but the receiving core, Aaron, with Donovan Peoples-Jones, Nico Collins, Oliver Martin. I'm starting to like what we're seeing with Oliver now, but I think maybe we're a little better off there, too, than we maybe thought we were on Labor Day weekend.
I agree. Nico has emerged quite a bit. He was a name we heard a little bit last year, and we were hearing a lot of buzz right before the season started once Tariq went down. And, I think Nico has kind of emerged as Michigan's down-the-field threat. He's got good hands. He's got really good size, too, and I think that's something people forgot. He's very much a similar guy to Tariq Black. So if Tariq started the season healthy and ended up playing, I can only imagine how good this receiving core would look. But they don't handle themselves well. Oliver Martin, like you mentioned, has come up in key situations. They're starting to get Jake McCurry and other guys involved there. They use the tight ends quite a bit too, and that's been a Jim Harbaugh staple we've seen the last few years. Obviously, they've really gotten Zach Gentry and Sean McCune involved heavily. They were involved quite a bit Saturday, obviously, combined I think for 5 catches and close to 60 or 70 yards. So it's done a good job. I think with Shea's ability to get outside the pocket and move and kind of create stuff, it's helped the receivers a little bit. Last year they were so much stuck in one-on-one coverage and just programmed to run routes that things didn't really work out with Shea. it kind of opens things up and it gives them extra life where, and receivers have talked about this the last few weeks where, they'll run a route, but they know not to stop because if the play continues, Shane, may find them elsewhere on the field or down the field. So it's a never-ending process, the receivers and the quarterback, but they've certainly improved, and Michigan's offense has looked better because of it.
Absolutely. I mean, last year at this time, the word we kept hearing when we were talking about our receiving core was separation. We're not getting any separation, and there are a lot of reasons that you don't. I mean, other than the Notre Dame game, what I've noticed is all of our receivers are coming off the line really well. They are getting separation. I think you have to give credit to McElwain for a lot of that.
You do, yeah. They got a big coaching crew there. You got Roy Roundtree there. You got 2 or 3 guys heavily involved in that process, and that was something that, I know they focused on a lot going back in spring. And some of that comes back to experience and just, knowing, having gone through a year at the college game and knowing what, opposing defensive backs or how they're going to play you and what they're looking for. But yeah, it's been a natural, I think, progression for the group. The coaching staff has certainly helped. I've heard, Peoples-Jones especially has raved about Jim McElwain and the job he's done with him. I think he called Jim his favorite coach he's ever had. So it's, and then you got Roy Roundtree, experienced guy who played the position a lot. So it's been nothing but, I think, but good for the Michigan receiving core so far.
With us on our game day segment this week, looking back at the Nebraska game. In a few minutes, we'll talk about this Saturday evening in Evanston, is beat writer Aaron McMann from MLive. Aaron, the defense has had a few rough patches here early in the season, as if we have much to complain about. But overall, this defense is still playing very, very well.
Yeah, and I think that was a thing people forgot. I haven't checked yet, but I know going into the Nebraska game, the unit was still 12th, I think, in the nation in total defense. So, it was still holding its own. They're still prone to giving up big plays, but I think by and large, they've done their job. They held Nebraska on the ground to I think 39 rushing yards on Saturday. For a while it was almost 0. I can remember that. So it was, the defensive line has done its job, and I think they're a little banged up. Linebackers have looked good. The secondaries, held its own. And I was really impressed with, the amount of pressure they got in Nebraska on Saturday. They didn't have the opportunity to throw the ball a ton, and when they did, it wasn't for much yardage. And by and large, I think the defense has been fine. You mentioned the penalties. That continues, I think, to be the elephant in the room. Going into the Nebraska game, it was, I think, 21 and 27 penalties against Michigan, depending against the defense. They've had a couple, 3 targetings now. Coley cuts in back-to-back games. I think that stems from more aggressiveness. I think, obviously we know Don Brown likes to play that, the high-risk, high-reward defense, man coverage, where they, rely on, one-on-one play, and that's fine. But, they're going to cut back on the penalties, and I think that's been their Achilles heel so far, that they're able to do that, and I'm sure they will. I mean, it's one of those things where, they realize what's going on. They know what they have to do to improve or, to change it. But no, I think this defense will be just fine. I think it ends up at the end of the year, they'll still be a top 5 unit in the country, and given Michigan's improvement offensively, I think that's just fine.
Well, and you mentioned Lee Cutts, and that if there was a downer on the defensive side, that was it. He sat out the first half. Then he gets to play most of the second half, and then for the second week in a row, even Jim agreed with the call, Aaron. Kleek's got to get that cleaned up, doesn't he?
He did. He said he acknowledged that it was a targeting penalty. It was helmet to face mass hit. Kleek led with his head, just like he had the previous week on the other quarterback. But in that instance, he was, that SMU quarterback was carrying the football and in between the tackles. But those are one of those mistakes where you can't make. And the thing is, too, it was late in the game. It was fourth quarter. Michigan was up big. It didn't really need to happen. But from Kleek's perspective, I get it. He hadn't played in the first half. He had just gotten in the second. He was still looking to play and get his stats and kind of, get back into the groove of things. And then that happens again. I'm sure the Michigan coaching staff has talked to him about it. I'm sure he realizes he can't do that. It's one of those things. It's unfortunate, for him and, from the Michigan perspective, I know they're not happy because they're going to lose him for the first half against Northwestern. But, it's again, it goes back, I think, to over aggressiveness. Some of these guys they're playing fast, obviously, and they're trying to make a tackle and everything else. But you got to pull up, and that's something Jim Harbaugh acknowledged Saturday after the win.
Well, another thing I was thinking about after the game on Saturday, Aaron, is back in August, a week before the season, Jim Harbaugh was asked about the punting job, and he said, "We're still working through that, still competing. We really don't have a punter right now." Well, Will Hart didn't get mentioned much, but so far through 4 games, his numbers, Aaron, are just insane. He has become a huge weapon. I don't think he can keep this pace up, but so far, wow, you've got to like what you're getting from him.
Yeah, I can remember talking to Chris Partridge, the special teams coordinator. Gosh, it was a week or two before the season started, and they had a 3-man punting competition at that point. They didn't know who the starter was going to be. And then Brad Robbins goes down with a back injury, and then Will Hart kind of ends up with the job. And you're right. So far, I think he's surprised everyone. He's averaged more than, I think, 52 or 53 yards a punt so far. I keep checking the national stats, and he hasn't punted enough to kind of register for to register for the top, the qualifications for the top punters in the country. But his per punt average, you put him near the top. So he's done very well. We spoke with Chris Partridge, I think, last week, and he said that he's doing a good job of recognizing, playing through conditions, and he's gotten stronger and more accurate, and you're right. They're really happy with what they got so far with him.
Well, this Saturday it's on the road to Evanston, 4:30 p.m. kickoff, and yes, there's going to be a ton of Michigan fans there, but it's still a road game. And Michigan does need an impressive win away from the big house, don't they, Aaron?
Yeah, they do. Northwestern obviously isn't ranked, but given the sour taste they got after the Notre Dame loss and everything else, it's a must win. It's a game. Michigan's got a lot of momentum right now. They've won 3 straight. They've scored 45 plus points in all 3 of those games. They're kind of back to where they started in the AP Top 25 poll. Things are looking up, and things and it needs. The momentum, I guess, needs to carry over to Northwestern. The Wildcats are, coming off a bye. They're only 1-2. They do have a Big Ten win. They beat Purdue week 1 at Purdue. But they're coming off a loss to Akron, so it's been a kind of a mixed bag for the Wildcats. They're not ranked right now, so it's a game Michigan needs to win. I think as last check, they're 13-point favorites. So Las Vegas expects them to win as well. But, you got to, like we mentioned, you got to cut down on the penalties. You got to eliminate the, turnovers. And I think if they play, relatively well on offense, I think this is a game that can certainly win.
Well, you would think so, but this Northwestern team, really hard for me to figure out. The only game that I've been able to see them play this year was Purdue. And, I thought they looked pretty good. I thought it was good to see Clayton Thorson back. He looked healthy. And, of course, they beat Purdue in a really tight ball game. Since then, they, on both sides of the ball, not played well. They don't look even close to last year's team, and they have so many people back.
Yeah. The last 2 games they played, they think they've thrown for 4 interceptions. Haven't got much of a rushing game going. They basically relied on one rusher the whole season, Jeremy Larkin. He rushed for 346 yards. Other than that, they don't have much going there. And then defensively, they've given up a lot of points. So it's been kind of a head scratcher there. They are, like I mentioned, they are coming off a bye, so maybe they figured some things out. They've had a week to obviously game plan for Michigan, which would certainly help. But I think at the end of the day, Michigan's talent and kind of depth should outweigh what Northwestern has.
You would think so, because on paper, even though they have a lot of people back, they just don't match up with Michigan very well. But one thing is they are a well-coached football team by Pat Fitzgerald and his staff. They are kind of with their backs against the wall after these last 2 performances. So it's one of those games. It's on the road. Michigan's got to come at them, I think, strong early and not let them hang around.
Absolutely. And it'll be another game where I'm kind of paying attention to the offensive line. Like I mentioned earlier, I was curious to see how they handled Nebraska, team that had done a good job of pressuring the quarterback and everything else, and I thought they handled themselves well. Northwestern will be another test. This time it's on the road. I do think Northwestern's a little bit better team than Nebraska is right now. And it's, like I said, Northwestern's coming off a bye. So I think, Michigan needs to be careful about not turning this into one of those sleeper games where they kind of look past them, and because they got Maryland after that at home, and the following week for homecoming. So it's the schedule's getting a little bit easier. I don't think Nebraska is anywhere near a top tier Big Ten team, but it is the road. It is a Big Ten team. You mentioned it being Pat Fitzgerald. He's always coached his team well, and they usually play above expectations. So it certainly isn't a game for Michigan to take lightly, that's for sure.
Final question for you, Aaron. Handing Nebraska a beat down at home, that was a lot of fun. And I think if we come to play on Saturday night, should get a W in Evanston. Then it's back home for Maryland, and they aren't playing defense, but their offense looks good. for the Terrapins, and then it's Wisconsin. Badgers are going to be, I think, the real measuring stick game for this Michigan team. And now there's some talk that might be the night game, Aaron.
Yeah, I've been saying that for a few weeks now. I think we weren't going to really find out how good or how talented this Michigan team is until they get into that meat of the Big Ten schedule: Nebraska, and Michigan State, and Penn State. And thankfully for Michigan, 2 of those 3 games are at home, and then they obviously finish Ohio State. But Nebraska is the first one. It's the game where Michigan's gonna have to show up, and Wisconsin. That's the game they're gonna have to show up and play well against. Wisconsin's coming off a curious loss to BYU 2 weeks ago. I think their expectations have dropped a little bit. I think in the minds of some of the national writers and the national media. But I do still think they got an impressive win over Iowa. I do still think they're the favorite, and they are the favorite right now in the Big Ten West. So it's that's the first one. Michigan's gonna have to come up, show up, and ready to play and win. Otherwise, it's going to be, I think, a similar situation after Notre Dame. People will be questioning whether, how far this offense has improved, and it'll be back to kind of where we were at after week 1.
First things first, take care of Northwestern and Evanston on Saturday night, and then we'll see. Our guest on our game day segment this week, taking a look back at a really good win over Nebraska on Saturday, and a peek ahead to this Saturday's game, I should say, with Northwestern, has been beat writer Aaron McMann from MLive. Always a pleasure to have you with us, Aaron.
Always glad to do it, Mike. Thanks.
Quick Hits is next as we wrap it up for another week here on The Michigan Man on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. On Quick Hits today, at Jim's presser on Monday, he had no injury updates at that time, but on his radio show Monday night, he said he is hopeful Chris Evans will play on Saturday, but he's not taking any chances. He said Chris is dealing with a muscle injury and is day-to-day. Jim also said he is hopeful Tariq Black will be able to play later this year, and he is coming along real well with rehab. There was some talk after the game on Saturday that Rashawn Gary was being worked on by trainers and suffered an injury early in the game on Saturday. On Monday, though, Rashawn said no injury. They were working on his shoulder pads. Jim is also very happy with the progress of freshman defensive lineman Aiden Hutchinson. He said Aiden is playing at an upperclassman level right now. There were no other injuries that were reported on Monday at Jim's presser or later on his radio show. On Thursday's show, we'll find out what's going on with this week's opponent, the Northwestern Wildcats. Our guest will be Teddy Greenstein from the Chicago Tribune, so make sure you join us on Thursday for that. Our free show app is available from the iTunes and Google Play stores. You can also hear us weekly on Spotify, Stitcher, iHeart, TuneIn, and Wolverine Sports Radio. Make sure you tell your Michigan family and friends about the show and join us each week. That will do it for our Game Day edition this week. On Thursday's Visitors Show, we'll have the latest injury news, game day notes, and hear from one of the most respected sports writers in the country, Teddy Greenstein from the Chicago Tribune. So until then, have a great Wolverine week, everyone. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Take care, and as always, go Blue. Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. That's themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!